Your absence has gone through me like thread through a needle, but even the needle at least has something to hold on to. The first memory I have of my father is a vague yet violent one. We lived in a three-family house in Queens, New York, through which any number of aunts, uncles, and cousins flowed like a never-ending river. I had to have been about 2 or 3 years old, sitting on the bed of my parents' room in the basement. The room was tiny, the walls made of a dark wood. My mother was packing a suitcase while I watched cartoons on the TV. My father came in. There was an argument, harsh words no toddler should hear. His face and her face yelling obscenities. She was pinned against the dresser. What happened next is fuzzy, a blur of movement and flying limbs. One of my uncles had his arms wrapped around my father's torso as he dragged him backwards out of the room, my father gripping the doorframe, bellowing. I don't remember what happened after that, what happened as we left the house, if we took a cab or if someone drove us, where we even went for solace. But that day, the bond between my father and I was irreparably torn. Mom and I moved to New Jersey, leaving you and everyone I'd known in New York. Visits were scheduled. I'd spend summers with you at the park, chasing the ice cream truck playing Mr. Softy's theme song. As I got older, visits became less frequent, less mandatory. I remember one summer you weren't there when I arrived, but when you got home you picked me up and swung me around. I think most kids would describe that feeling as elation, feeling like a balloon being released into the air, feeling protected, feeling loved. I remember feeling surprised that you seemed so happy to see me. That's the first hug I remember receiving from my father, and it felt unnatural. I remember car rides to the city to run errands or visit family.
Lord of mercy, I need the very, very bad. Any lover with me want nothing.
Bob Marley or Beres Hammond crooning through the speakers as the sun blazed down on us with the windows rolled. I can't remember ever having a real conversation with my father. He never asked, and I never told. I took it for granted that maybe I was quiet by nature and had perhaps inherited it from you. But on those car rides, I was content to just be in the moment. My father always used to take me shopping, I remember, and I'd always get whatever I wanted. But as I got older, the shopping sprees started to bother me. It seemed to be the only thing we ever did when I came to visit, and I somehow felt as if maybe he was trying to, quite literally, pay for his mistakes. I used to call my father all the time, but it was only to set up the next visit. By the time I was 14, I realized he never called me to see how I was doing or to ask me to come see him, and by then, when I went to visit, he was hardly ever there. He was usually working late and wouldn't get home until early in the morning. He'd fathered another child, my little brother, and during those visits it would just be us, keeping each other company while our father slept, us sitting around the house waiting for something to happen. When Mom decided to move us from New Jersey to North Carolina when I was 16, I dreaded having to tell him. I wasn't sure how he'd react, but it didn't surprise me that he'd barely had any reaction at all. I think maybe I was hoping he would fight to keep me near. Maybe even ask if I wanted to leave or if I would want to stay and live with him. But even so, I knew that I didn't want to. After we moved, the first 2 years, I made it a point to try and visit every summer, if not to see my father, at least to see my brother. He did make it to my high school graduation, for which I was grateful, and for which he seemed proud. By the time I was 20, I was working and in college, and saw no point to visit. If I made plans to visit, it was only at the urgings of my brother. One year, I asked if you'd be able to get my plane ticket so that I could visit for Christmas, and you promised you would. The day I had planned to leave, I still had not heard from you, and I had no plane ticket. I called and called and called, and each time was forwarded to your voicemail. I had to explain to my brother, who was only 12 at the time, why I wouldn't be there to see him like I promised, without somehow defacing his image of you. In the end, more was broken that day than promises. I was willing to give you a second chance. Your mother, my grandmother, had moved back to Grenada. I had never been to Grenada, and I asked once again, months in advance, if you could help me pay for the plane ticket. I even offered to pay for half, to which you said, "Don't worry about it. I'll take care of it." I called a month before I intended to leave for the visit, and you said you would let me know in 2 weeks. That was the last time we spoke. 2 weeks later, I hadn't heard from you, and when I tried to call, I was again forwarded to your voicemail. It's been 2 years since we last spoke, and my brother, who is now 16, tells me that he doesn't speak to you either, and you live in the same city. One of my favorite singers says in a song, "We started with a tear in the fabric of our relationship, and no matter how many times I tried to sew it back together, there was always another hole, another tear. My stepfather has been in my life since I was 3, and he treats me more like his own child than you ever did. But because I didn't have the foundation of what a father-daughter relationship is supposed to be like, I don't know how to reciprocate his love for me. The irony is, he's always asking if I've spoken to you and encouraging me to reach out. He says, some men don't know how to be fathers, and it's up to the children to teach them. Maybe someday I will call you again. Maybe someday I will teach you. It's never too late.